You are listening to Meet the Thriller Author, the podcast where I interview writers of mysteries, thrillers, and suspense books. I'm your host, Alan Peterson, and this is episode number 169. In this episode of the podcast, we'll be meeting Miranda Beverly-Whittemore, who is a New York Times bestselling author of 5 novels. Her latest, Fierce Little Thing, is a psychological thriller that explores the monstrous secrets that linger amongst old friendships. The book is available now, so you can order it from your favorite bookseller. A reminder to please rate and review this podcast on your favorite app. It helps getting the word out to others. And do check out my website at thrillerauthors.com for show notes, to access my archive of over 160 interviews, and to join the Thrilling Reads mailing list, where you can get deals on mystery and thriller books. All right, here is my interview with Miranda Beverly-Whittemore. Miranda is a New York Times bestselling author of 5 novels, and her latest novel, Fierce Little Thing, was just published on the 27th. We're recording this on the 28th, so that was just yesterday. So congratulations.
Yay, thank you so much.
Yeah, so how's the first 24 hours going of the new book launch?
Pretty great. I mean, this is my 5th book and the first book I've published in a pandemic, so it's very isolated. I mean, it's already such a strange day anyway, but I basically spent the day in my house on social media, and then I did a book event, but it was virtual, and that was wonderful. But it was so weird not to be able to hug anybody involved in the process.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. It'll probably be another year or so, huh? But before things hopefully start going back a little bit back to normal, but who knows now?
Who knows?
Yeah.
Hopefully soon.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about your background, please?
You mean my life, where I'm from, who I am?
Before you started writing novels, what led you to that part of your life?
Great question. I grew up all over the place. My father's an anthropologist and my mother's an ethnographer and writer. And so I actually spent 3 of the first 6 years of my life living in a small Senegalese village. And we were really integrated into that community in a way that was, I really didn't speak English. I spoke a tribal language, Mendingakan, and I lived in a very, very traditional way. And then we moved back to rural Vermont when I was 6, so I could start 1st grade. And it was a really jarring transition, as you might imagine. And my parents had another baby. And then we moved to Oregon for a large chunk of my childhood. And then I came to college at Vassar. I went to Vassar, which was in Poughkeepsie, and I fell in love with someone there who is now my husband, and we moved to New York for 20 years. And then now we live in Vermont again. So a pandemic move. So we lived, I was an actor as a child, and I really wanted to be part of theater a lot. And I thought that would be my life. And then I went to Vassar, where there's a strong theater program. And I realized that I really didn't want to be part of, it was a very professional kind of theater program. There were a lot of people who were in that program who had been on television or acted on Broadway. And of course that makes sense because it's in close proximity to New York, but I was from the West Coast, so I didn't really have any access to that world at all. And so then I just found myself suddenly gravitating towards the English department. I mean, as I said, my mother's a writer, so I definitely had thought about that life, but I had never thought of it for myself. And then I wrote my senior thesis was about my experience of living in the Senegalese village. It was a novel in verse, and I loved the process of writing it. And then I got a job working at the Poetry Center at the 92nd Street Y in New York City after college, basically helping run the reading series, which included, contracts and going through making sure that people had the right headshots, and then when a writer would show up, making sure that they had a glass of water and that they were happy backstage. And through that process I met people like Toni Morrison and Jose Saramago and Philip Roth and really Seamus Heaney, really amazing writers. And I think that was the first moment that I thought oh, this could be a career. I didn't even think of that yet. So it took me a while to get there. I was in my early 20s at that point. And then I basically sat down and wrote. Had sent that first novel in verse out very early to agents, and I'd actually gotten representation, which then had dissolved. And so then I basically sent it out again to the person who's now been my agent since I was in my early 20s. I'm now in my mid 40s. And she said, I can't publish this. It's a novel in verse about a small West African village, but I would love to be your agent, or I'd love to see something else from you. So I wrote another book and I sent it to her, and she said, I'd love to be your agent. And then we sold that book, and that was my first novel, The Effects of Light, which came out in 2005.
Wow. Was that also like a mystery thriller type book?
It was, my first two novels were more kind of like straight up literary fiction. I mean, I think I've been thinking about this a lot. I think one of the tricky parts about what I write is that it's both genre. It's thriller, psychological thriller in many ways, or gothic thriller sometimes. But then I also write those forms as a literary fictionist. So I have this kind of I love beautiful prose, and it's really important to me to have that be integrated into the into this kind of like page turny. I think of it as kind of like I write books like the books I want to read when I'm on vacation. So I write books that have this kind of literary slant. So I've been kind of describing Fierce Little Thing as a literary psychological thriller, which I don't know if that makes it more or less appealing to people. But I think that's probably the most honest way to describe it.
Yeah, there's so many different categories and subgenres now. You look at Amazon, it's like, I'm like, oh, I didn't even realize that was
Isn't
already
that
a little category.
So funny. I know. It's so true.
I mean, there must be like 1,000 categories on Amazon just for books.
Well, and in fact, when my editor, who I'm really close to, because she and I edited Bittersweet together, and she acquired my fourth novel, June. So we really wanted to work together. She's now at a new publishing house, and we work together on Fierce Little Thing. We have a very close relationship, so it's actually really fun because she asks me what I think it should be classified as, which I think a lot of editors probably don't ask the writers. And we had a kind of a back and forth back before she, officially kind of like filed the whatever you need to do to kind of put that in with all the powers that be at various books, book sales. And it's a really interesting process to talk about, like, well, is this a psychological thriller? What does that mean? Fascinating.
Yeah, so confusing too, because it's this psychological thrillers, and all of a sudden I'm hearing more domestic thriller. I'm like, oh,
yeah, I know. What does it all mean? What does it all mean?
Yeah, in the end, the story is all that matters in the end, anyway. But
this is so true.
Yeah, it's the business though. I think that's good too, because you mentioned, you came out, you had a pretty good background on the business part of it when you were on that job that you had, so that probably helps a lot.
It was incredibly helpful to see what an editor does and what a publicist does and what a writer is expected to do. It was definitely, it was really coming up through that. There's my friend Joanna Rakoff has a wonderful new movie out based on her novel, her memoir, My Salinger Year, which is about the year in her life that she worked at an agency. And we're quite close now, but we didn't realize that we actually were friends, that we actually must have known each other because she had that job at that agency around the same time that I was doing a job at the Poetry Center. And they're very similar kind of way to learn about that whole publishing world, which is like completely its own beast, in great and challenging ways.
Yeah, I think that's what I get people to ask me sometimes about. Oh, I just want to write. I'm like, well, that's probably not going to happen anymore. So
yeah, it's true. I mean, so much. I mean, this is my publishing day was yesterday, and I basically for the last 6 weeks solid, I've just basically been creating content in various ways and making myself accessible for content that is being created. I mean, and that's essentially a huge part of the job. And it's like, then I'm like maintaining my website and making sure that all my social media accounts have the right information. And that's a lot of the job.
Yeah. Talk to people like me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, so, this part is a pleasure.
Yeah. I always enjoy meeting new writers, and it's a lot of fun. So can you tell us a little bit about your book? Like, if people aren't familiar with your writing, like, what's your writing like?
I'd love to.
What can they expect about your books?
So Fierce Little Thing, I'll just give you a quick
Mhm.
synopsis and then I'll talk a little bit about it. It's about a group of children who all end up living on this commune when they're like, by the time they're 12. The protagonist and narrator, Saskia, you meet her when she's 12 and she goes to live on this commune through a series of kind of strange twists in her life. And this group of 5 children end up becoming a very tight-knit group. And the commune pretty quickly devolves into a less ideal living situation. It becomes more like a cult, with a charismatic leader and who's making pretty bad choices. And the adults pretty much abandon them, and they're kind of forced to do something really terrible in a last ditch effort to try to save the cult. And it doesn't work. So the book is told in 2 different sections that go back and forth. The past, in which we follow that story, and that question is the kind of the arc that is the question in that part of the book is, what did they do? And then in the present day, someone starts to blackmail all of them. They are scattered to the wind. Have very different lives. Some of them are still very ensconced in. One of them is very ensconced still in kind of like a very back to the land, no possessions kind of movement. And then to various degrees, they're all living other versions of normal American lives, and they start to be blackmailed, and they have to get back together, and they have to go back to the land where they first kind of did this terrible thing to confront their blackmailer and figure out what to do. So that question, the arc of that question is, what will they do? So these 2 questions that are supporting the book, and you go back and forth in time. And for me, the great pleasure of that is you get to know these people both when they're children and then when they're adults. And of course, there are things that have changed radically about them, but for the most part, they are exactly who they've always been, which is something I always love in a book or in life. When you get to go to like a reunion or you run into someone you went to middle school with in the grocery store, and they look the same, and their laugh is the same, and they mention a joke that they think is funny, and you go like, that's exactly the kind of joke you would have told me when you were 12. So for me, that pleasure of the book is really it's deep. I loved writing that, and I hope it's enjoyable to read. And then there's also a lot about the place that they live. They live on this place called Home, which is an abandoned summer camp that they've kind of like jerry-rigged to make a community to various effects. And that life there is very much about the wilderness and about the animals and the plants. And Saskia, our main character, learns how to forage from an older woman who's kind of part of the community. And that is a very big part of it, the learning how to feed yourself from the land, which was really fascinating to learn about.
And so I'm so fascinated with cults. I just saw I think it was on the Heaven's Gate.
Oh yeah, I know.
I saw that documentary. Just binged that one. I was like, it's just so fascinating. Is that something you were interested that you wanted to see if you could apply that to a book or?
So I grew up adjacent to a lot of communal living. I mean, I obviously lived in a small West African village, which is by nature communal. But in terms of American communal living, I never lived on a commune. But my husband grew up on a radical lesbian commune on the Upper West Side, actually, where there was a lot of political action. And I have other people from his life and then also from my own life who grew up in communes variously around the country. And I was always really fascinated in their stories about what it was to be, especially a child in a place like that, where the adults in your life have essentially made the decision that kind of like normal American culture is broken or doesn't work, and you have to. And so you're starting out your life with this idea that the only way to live is kind of a rejection of the American model. And that was really interesting to me. I had this really intense thing happen where my husband and a couple of the people who he grew up with us on the commune got together. And I was there too for a lunch because someone who had grown up on the commune had come into town, and she was older. She had lived on the commune as a teenager, so not as a little child. And that's not to say that it wasn't a very challenging lifestyle and that there weren't some really hard things that happened to my husband and his friends there, but they were really little. They were really small children when they lived there. So it was the only life they knew. And this woman who we hadn't really seen much of, she was really upset talking to us about the life that she'd spent there. And she basically said, do you know how much it ruined my life to basically live in this place where I was taught to believe that everything was wrong about the way Americans were living. And it was my responsibility to stop police violence, right? It was my responsibility to fight for Black liberation. But I was surrounded by regular 12-year-olds who didn't even know what that was, right? And it was like, the stakes were so high for me. And she said, and then of course we just left the commune and suddenly I was expected to be part of that normal life. And I had basically been taught my entire life that life was awful. And so that was a great tragedy for me. And I thought, wow, I really want to write about what that must feel like, to be suddenly have this world that you fought for just be pulled out from under you.
And so what's that process for you like? So you have that idea now in your head, like, wow, I want to write about that. So what's your process like then? Do you from when you get the idea till you sit down to write it, and now that it's published, can you walk us through that process?
Yeah. So usually it ends up being kind of multiple things that come together. So there's that. And then I also knew a place is very important in my books. And I know I have to really love a place and know it very well to write about it. And this place that the book is set is based on a place where my husband's mother lives now, a place that's been in his family for many years. And, he and I have known each other for so long that I've been going there for like 25 years. It's a lakeside, just like in a small town in Maine. And then there were a couple other elements. I wanted to write about a group of friends. I had in fact, my book is dedicated to a group of friends that I spent time at summer camp with at a day camp, who I was so passionately involved in this. And I wanted to talk about how passionate those friendships are at that age, how deeply loyal you are, how you would do anything for those people. And to think about what would happen if an adult took advantage of that idea of you as being this powerful force and then figured out how to use you as a weapon. That was really interesting to me. So those different pieces came together and I started writing this almost as like a symphonic piece with a lot of different voices telling the story. And it became clear to me very quickly that was just not going to work. There were too many moving parts and we needed some grounding. And in fact, at the time, my writing partner, Emily Rabateau, who's a brilliant writer in her own right, had read the book and she basically was like, she'd read the first 100 pages of the draft. And she basically pointed to Saskia and she said, this is the character. Mm-hmm. This is the person who the book should be about, not anybody else, and I'm noticing there's a really loud noise. Should I close the door? Are you okay? Can you hear it? Okay.
No, I don't hear it. No.
Okay, good. So she just basically said, this is the character. This is who you need to write. And of course, there's always this temptation when you've written like 100 pages to say like, but I've written 100 pages.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And she said like, yeah, but like you got to this place where now we know that she's the character you need to write about. So like you need to write about her. She's the most interesting. She's so weird. And she wrestles. I mean, I think the conversation around whether women should be likable is ridiculous, but I also understand that it's a conversation that happens a lot. And I think what I really love about Saskia is that on paper, she should be unlikable, but when you get to know her, you love her. And that's really fascinating to me. What is it about someone that makes them maybe seem prickly? Or if you were to know them in real life, you'd think like, that's a crazy lady. But when you're inside her head, you can't help but adore her and want the best things for her. And that became this motivating factor. Once I keyed into that and I understood her, the novel was as easy as a novel can be to write. Not easy, but
yeah, never easy, right?
Never easy.
It's interesting that you mentioned that about the female protagonist, because I just thought about that a couple of days ago. I was reading some reviews, and especially for psychological thrillers, it seems like usually the female protagonist, the girl on the train and all that, all those books. And I've noticed that a lot of times when the bad reviews are like, oh, I don't like her at all. And she's not,
I
there's no,
know.
and I don't remember reading that about male. I mean, I'm sure it happens, but I don't really remember seeing that too much with a male
You
protagonist.
don't, do you? Because
Yeah, no,
because our world is full of misogyny. It's based on misogyny and racism. So yes, of course, no one talks about that. Absolutely. I know,
yeah,
it's infuriating.
it was fascinating though too, though, is that a lot of time though the reviews appear to be from women also. So is it? I don't know if it's just so weird. It just kind of dawned on me
I
too
think
that
women, I mean, I think that's why white women voted for Trump, because I think white women, um, like enact that violence against other women because it's like internalized misogyny. Like you hate of, because I think a lot of those women who are like, feel like there have to be rules, they've subscribed their own life to these ideas of rules. And so they can't handle anyone who's not following the same rules.
So it's like
You know
the
what I mean?
Karen meltdown.
Right. It's Karen, I think. I think it is that.
Oh, I feel bad for women named Karen now, but
I know, I do too. It's so
that
hard
name
to
is
be named
ruined.
Karen.
And
I know.
they had the baby names, and that name has like
Is way down.
way down. Like, oh, it's a nice name, but yeah, it's kind of like a bad one now.
It's rough.
Yeah. And so back to, yeah, sorry for that side tangent, but on your writing process, so do you outline these, or do you kind of like write by the seat of your pants, or?
So I'm an outliner, but I very strongly believe, I think of my outline as like a highway from A to Z, the A being the first word and Z being the last. And that means that if I have that map, I can off-road. So I love having an outline because it makes me feel safe to make radical choices that maybe aren't what I thought I would do, because I know where I'm heading, if that makes sense. And with a book like this, with cast of thousands, 2 different time periods, many plot points, many reveals, I don't think I could physically write a book like this if I didn't have at least a little outline, you know? And honestly, an outline helped me a ton during this past year because the pandemic turned everyone's life upside down. But in my particular case, my family left our home of 20 years and moved, and there was an 8-month period in which we didn't have a home, and we were living actually communally with other people to try to kind of like keep our kids going. We didn't have any childcare. We still don't have childcare, you know? So, having an outline that meant that I could like make use of every spare moment was the only way I finished this book. And I felt I had to, because economically I needed to get paid. And I wanted this, I knew it would be a summer book and I wanted it to come out this summer. And so I knew working backwards, I had to finish it. So I really, really was grateful to the work that I had done in the past. I was like, those moments when you're like, thanks past self for helping me out, that I had this thing that I could really look to and really say, like, I need to go from, this point to this point today. And I know what that is.
I'm kind of curious too, with the whole pandemic, is that something that you're addressing in your books? Are you planning to address it? Or are you ignoring it? The COVID fatigue?
Well, what's so interesting is this book is really thematically on point with pandemic. I mean, it's about a group of people who are afraid the world's going to end and are afraid of the outside world. In the present day, our main character is living by herself in isolation, cut off from the world completely with very little contact. And she every day she bakes sourdough bread. And there are these people in the past of the commune, it's a group of people who are basically just trying to keep themselves going, trying to survive, making sourdough, making do with the food that they have. And I think especially early in the pandemic, that was definitely something we were all wrestling with. We were all thinking about. And we made a decision pretty early on in the pandemic not to make the present day of the story post-COVID in an obvious way, just because we didn't know what this moment would look like, and we knew the book would come out. Right now, I mean, there's this weird thing that happens with books is that it's like a year, right? So I think I played with it for like 1 3-day period where I was kind of like, do I want to talk about vaccines, or do I want to talk about mask wearing, and we just decided like the book thematically tells enough of a similar story that it can stay on its own and it doesn't need to be addressed. And in fact, we thought then that for readers, they would encounter thinking and fear that felt familiar without me needing to point out that that's what it was, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So just kind of curious too on the tools that you use. I'm always nosy about this. Do you use like Word for your outline and for your writing?
I use Word. I sometimes I use Scrivener, but I have to say I'm old school. I like just like a Word. And my sister is 7 years younger than I am, and she's a filmmaker, so she's not like words. Writing is not her home medium, and she very freely is like, Word sucks. It's terrible. It doesn't make any sense. And I think it's kind of like speaking English, where like you can look back on English and understand, especially if you have I have a 4-year-old, so she's learning how to read. And there are all of these times that I find myself going like, I know that doesn't make any sense, but there's a silent K before the word no. And it's not the same as the word no opposite of yes. And, and you hear yourself saying it, you think like English is insane, but that's the language I speak. Right. And that's how I feel about Word. I also love working off the page. I mean, we're off the computer. I write on the computer. I admire writers who write longhand, but I don't have it in me. But I love an art project. And I think it's really lovely to get off the page and to cut up what you've already written and put it together like that, or to use note cards, use different colored pens. I'm a big fan of the stationery store, Staples, I love to staple things up and kind of be messy in a way of thinking out, especially when I'm outlining at the beginning. I find it's much easier for me to do that if I'm off the page, or take a huge piece of paper and scribble all over it. Yeah.
And do you usually have a set, do you set writing hours, or do you write in the same place, or you mix it up a little bit?
Well, so this past year upended all of that.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
I lost my house and I lost my desk and I lost my childcare. And it was quite, actually, now looking back on it, I would never want to have to do that again, but quite affirming that I'm quite flexible in ways that I didn't know. That I'm able to access my brain even in less than ideal situations time and again. So ideally, yes, I have time every day that I can work. I find that I'm really, when let's say my children are off happily at school and I have 9 hours to devote to my work every day, which is not even probably true if they're at school, but let's say that it happens. I'm really only good for about 3 or 4 hours at the most at my peak, when I'm cooking on a story and I'm just clipping along. I can't really do much creative work beyond that because my brain just gets so tired, and then I start to do damage to the process. So actually, this job is surprisingly great for being a parent, because when your children have childcare, because I can get a full day of work done and still accomplish other parts of my own job and then other parts of jobs for my family in a day realistically, when things are at their most ideal.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because that's something I would imagine if someone's not a writer, but to 3-4 hours, or when you put out 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 word days, it really does drain you. And it's kind of weird.
It's exhausting.
Yeah, you're just kind of in a daze after that.
And you have to, and that's the thing that's interesting about writing a novel, is it's really a marathon. It's not a sprint. So you have to give yourself, I have a lot of days, Jamie Attenberg has a great project, 1,000 Words of Summer. And I find that for me, that's a great goal. 1,000 words a day. And then with the surprise extra, sometimes I get to 1,400 and I go oh, who knew? Is a great goal to hit. I've done NaNoWriMo a couple times and never ended up with a book from that process, but just to kind of as an exercise. And I find that pace to be punitive. I think trying to write 1,500 words, or maybe it's even more than that, 1,700 words a day, every day for a month, it undoes for me the benefits. So I think it's more like maybe hitting 1,000 words and always kind of going over for a work week and then having some time off. I'm a big believer in the work week. I think it's great. I think you need time off. To read and to just daydream and to hang out with the people you love and do other stuff. Like that's what makes, that's also when I solve a lot of problems in my writing. And if I were just always sitting looking at the page, I think I would have less of a chance to solve those problems. I did an interview yesterday and someone asked me in the Q&A, what do you do when the words don't come? And I said, I think that's actually always a sign that I need to listen to, which is that you can't always force good writing, and you shouldn't, right? There are times when you're on a deadline and you think like, well, this is the best I'm going to be able to come up with. But those moments for me are always about kind of sprinting to the finish. And in a process like writing a novel, if words aren't coming, it usually means that I need a break, or that what I'm trying to write actually not working, which also means I need a break because I need some time away from it to actually have the perspective to see, oh, this choice I've made is just not the right choice.
And I also wondered too, with as a reader, what kind of books did you like to read before you became a novelist, and what kind of writers have influenced you?
Oh, I love that question. I mean, I love reading. Yeah. I love reading. So I'm going to think about books that I can tell you that I love. So one of the things that's made me really honored in this time is that the book Fierce Little Thing has gotten now 3 review comparisons to Donna Tartt's work. And I love her work. And I think even when she doesn't follow through on the promise of the book's always magnificent anyway. Like I loved The Goldfinch. I think it's a giant mess in many ways. I think those first 50 pages are brilliant. And then I think that there's the stuff that's in Vegas for pages and pages and pages. It's like, I think she could have used an editor. But I didn't mind reading them, right? Like I loved her. So that's a huge honor. I also love Kate Atkinson's work. She's really amazing. And I love her Jackson Brodie series, but I also love Life After Life and God Among Ruins. I think those books are genius. I'm a big fan of the older British ladies. So I love Pat Barker, the Regeneration trilogy. Have you ever read that?
No, I haven't.
Brilliant. It's about World War I and shell shock. And it's just, I mean, it's truly a knockout. It's just amazing. I love Hilary Mantel, who's just a genius. Like that her series about why am I not going to remember his name? But her recent series, I just think is incredible. She's just so smart and so on top of things. A.S. Byatt, I love. I really am a fan of older British women. But of course, there's many, many, many other writers and many contemporary writers who I adore too. But I would say that probably coming up as a writer, those books really influenced me because those writers, because they write really juicy plot, but maybe as a product of having been part of the British school system, their prose is just remarkable. Like you can just like reading any of those books, it's just like butter. Like you just go like, oh, here I am, and you're just going to take care of me. And you just, the language is just so exquisite. You can't, you just want to be inside of the words of this person who's just giving it to you. And I love that.
Yeah. And also I want to mention the cover for Fierce Little Thing is really cool.
Thank you.
How excited was that when you first got that? Because I know we don't have much input on that, but
I was thrilled. I mean, again, I will say that my editor is so great because she basically said, what are your hopes and dreams for a cover? What do you want? And I will do everything to, if it makes sense to me, I'll do everything to fight for that. And my cover for Bittersweet, which is my New York Times bestseller, is a kind of, this is like the dark counterpoint to that cover. It's interesting because it's 2 different publishing houses, but they clearly, with Fierce Little Thing, they really were trying to get at that same feeling. Bittersweet is this golden cover. It's, they have a shine on it. So it kind of sparkles and it's this house on the other side of a lake in golden light, and you just think like, I want to go there, oh, I want to go to that place. And the font though is very foreboding. It almost looks like teeth. And so Fierce Little Thing is like very, very dark with these pine woods behind it and a house on the opposite lake, the opposite shore of a lake. And then the letters are these really big toothy letters that go kind of like are terrifying, that have like a toothy quality to them, that are in some ways, the word fierce is actually behind some pine trees, the tops of some pines. And the second I saw it, I was like, I love it. And the only note I had, which the designer was wonderful to help me with, was that I felt that the shoreline looked a little too well maintained. There was like a picket fence and the roof looked a little nicer. And there was like signage. And I just said like, it needs to look decrepit, because this is like an old rundown summer camp. It can't look like a place we necessarily would want to go on vacation.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm looking at it now, and I can see that. Yeah. Yeah. With a little nice picket fence and stuff. Yeah. I'd be kind of like, oh, I want to go there. This is
ominous. Yeah. I wanted it to be ominous. I wanted you to think like, what is the fierce little thing? And what is it in that house?
Yeah. Very, very cool. Very cool. It's so fascinating how the whole process works.
Isn't it so interesting? I mean, there's so much that I think that is, now that this is my 5th book, I feel like I have a sense of kind of the rhythm of that year before publication. And there's so much stuff that happens behind the scenes that when you first start out, you have no idea how it works. It's very confusing.
And so what are you working on now?
Well, that's a great question. I'm actually, so I have a couple of co-writers and a production company, and we're developing Bittersweet as a series, which has been really a fun process. And we're about to start pitching, which is great. It's such a different world, that TV world, learning how to tell a story in the right way. And that's been a really fun process. And I'm also starting another novel. I've written about 50 pages of a new novel. And I'm not totally convinced it's the right next book, but I'm really tantalized by it. And then there's another book I've just started thinking about. Sometimes what happens is that I think I'm going to write one book, and then I start having fantasies about another book. It's kind of like having a love affair. Yeah. And then I start writing that other book. And then what often happens is I realize that it's actually the same book, that I just didn't see part of it.
That's good. So then you're able to merge them too.
Yeah. Usually then I can put them together. Yeah. So we'll see. I'm not quite sure, but I'm still in that fun, I really, getting Fierce Little Thing out into the world has been my main focus. And I find that I'm someone who can't really do creative work when I'm in this mode of getting the word out. I can do it when it's like not full court press time, maybe in a month or two when I'm doing a podcast a week, and kind of like I can make it so that one day a week is a day that I'm doing publicity stuff, and then the rest of the time I'm working on writing. I can do it, but I can't really be creative when I have this hat on.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, because it's like nonstop. The publicity hat on you.
Yeah, and it's also like just like the putting yourself out there.
Yeah.
I mean, it's two very different impulses in the brain. One of them is like this deeply internal me alone in a room. If you make a movie about someone writing a novel, it's like the most boring movie you could ever see, because it's just some random person sitting there staring out the window and then typing. But this part of it, right, is like having a conversation with people over and over again. And it's kind of the same conversation with really interesting, different takes on it, depending on who you're doing that work with. And so that's like deeply extroverted,
Yeah, I can imagine the pitching too. Like you say, you're pitching the series. Is that with the pandemic now? Is it mostly through video, or is it in person?
Yeah. So that's the thing that's pretty, I mean, our producers are basically like, look, we don't know what the fall is going to look like, because I think probably now because of Delta, this was a few months ago when we were talking about this, they were kind of like, maybe you'll fly to LA and maybe it'll be in the room. I'm thinking now, likely because of the Delta variant, that it'll probably be a Zoom thing, which in some ways is actually kind of lovely
Yes.
because you only have to look, I mean, especially as a woman, you think about this, you only have to look presentable from like the waist up, and you can have kind of notes on the main screen where you're doing it, and you have control over the AV part of things, because you're like we actually like you do a screen share, so our production company's assistant basically handles the slides. So that's like a very it's still scary. I'm not gonna say, like, it's still a scary thing because you're pitching to like really important people at really important streaming platforms, but then you get to leave and then you're just back in your own space. Whereas like I would love someday to pitch in person, but it seems a lot scarier to like drive to HBO and then park and then go inside and then get a pass and then ride up the elevator and then wait in the, like that seems like terrifying to me.
Yeah, it's the job interview times 10.
Right. And then you're in the room with these people. And that the difference of that is that you then have to have really it completely memorized. So a pitch is like between like 25 and 30 minutes long.
Oh, wow.
So it's like a really in-depth, and this is a book that I wrote, and now I've developed this show for more than 2 years, but I'm still scared at the thought of like, if you were to say, do the pitch for me right now, I would be like, oh, okay. What are the important elements you need to know? So it's a different world.
Yeah, crazy. Okay, well, the last question I like to ask my guests always, and I know it's kind of a cliche, but any advice for aspiring writers, because they're out there. I have subscribers who are aspiring writers.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that the biggest, most important quality to have if you want to be a writer is persistence. And I think that is an underrated quality. If you keep showing up and you work really hard and you keep just saying, I'm here, I'm doing this, I'm here, that eventually you find your place in this industry. And this is an industry with many gatekeepers. I think even if you're self-publishing, there are gatekeepers because what you need in order for people to read your books is for someone to help you tell those people that your book exists. And so the challenge is being persistent even when you feel absolutely crushed by disappointment, which is a lot of this job, right? A lot of the job is feeling like, I worked so hard on this thing. I worked harder than I've ever worked in my life, and no one read it, or no one bought it, or no one wants to publish it, or, no one thinks it's good enough, right? Whatever those things are, that is guaranteed to happen in a writing career. So I think that concept of grit, which is something I really try to build in my children, because I think that's true of life in many ways, but especially if you're going to be an artist, is so important. It's kind of a mix of hubris and it's like being super confident in yourself and also being an idiot, right? To think that this would be a good choice to just, and I was talking to my sister a couple of months ago when I had finally handed in Fierce Little Thing, like the final draft. There's so many months where you read the book and you edit it and then you send it off and then you get notes back, and you read the book and edit it and you send it off and you get notes back. And by the time you finish with that process, you're so done with your book. You think like, oh my God, this is horrible. And I think Zadie Smith said something wonderful about it. It's like, it's so frustrating that just at the moment when you've read your book so many times that you know all the ways in which it has completely failed, that is when you're supposed to go into the world and say like, hey, buy my book. It's fantastic. But I think that there is something really, fun about the fact that when you get to that place, you actually then want to write another book, which is what happened with my sister, where she was talking to me and she's like, oh my gosh, you turn it in. This is amazing. you can finally breathe. Like, what next? And I was like, well, I've started to think about another novel. And she just looked at me and she was like, it's a mental illness. You have a mental illness.
Yeah, we're insane.
And I was like, I just started laughing. I was like, yeah, you're right. She was like, you think you want to do this again? Do you remember what the last 3 years of your life have been like?
Oh, yes.
It's a good note. But I think persistence. I mean, I really do. I think persistence is in some ways more important than quote unquote talent, because it's that 10,000 hours thing. I mean, it's not just true in terms of what you give to the outside world, but what you give to your work. It's like if you show up every day or whenever you can and you put in that time and you get those 10,000 hours of learning how to be a writer, you will be a writer, mm-hmm. Because you'll have that practice. And I think that, someone who doesn't want to do that isn't going to do it, if that makes sense. It's all well and good to say, I mean, I could say I want to be a pole vaulter and I might be able to do that for like 70 hours. And then at some point my body or my mind would go like, it's not worth it anymore.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. If it was easy, everybody would be doing this, right?
That's true. It's so glamorous.
Yeah. So where can people find you? Let's say you have a website.
Yeah. My website is mirandabw.com. I'm also, really active on Instagram. My handle is MirandaBW1. And you can find me on all the social media sites from my website. But yeah, I mean, I love interacting with people. And I will also say that I love doing book clubs over Zoom. It's so nice now that people are so, one upside of the pandemic is I feel like people didn't even know what Zoom was a year ago. And now people are so savvy with it. Yeah. And it's not so crazy to think of doing that. So, I love connecting with people and I love it when people email me. So please be in touch.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Miranda. And Fierce Little Thing, by the time your listeners are listening to this, it'll be out. So go get that book.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Meet the Thriller Author. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with one of your favorite writers of mysteries and thrillers. Or if this episode's guest is new to you, I hope you give their books a chance. Helping listeners discover new authors and books is one of the coolest outcomes of doing this podcast. As always, you can head over to thrillerauthors.com to sign up to my Thrilling Reads email list. That way you won't miss out on any great deals in thriller and mystery books. You can also check out all the links and resources in the show notes for this episode over at thrillerauthors.com. And also please do subscribe to this podcast if you haven't done so already, and leave a rating and review wherever it is that you're listening to this show. If you have done that already, I thank you. I really do appreciate your support. For my other links to my author website, social media haunts, and more, check out thrillingreads.com/links. All my links will be on that page. So that's it for this episode. See you next time and stay safe out there.